The weight of wanting. At 6:15 a.m., Esther's alarm clicked on with the hushed tones of NPR's morning news. She listened without hearing it, eyes fixed on the ceiling above her bed. The room smelled faintly of lavender and floor polish, a holdover from Saturday's meticulous cleaning. She rose, brushed her teeth in rhythmic strokes, slipped on the same oatmeal-colored bra and panty set she always wore on Tuesdays, and buttoned into her beige cardigan with practiced precision. She drove her compact sedan through the quiet streets, a thermos balanced between her knees at red lights. At the library, she entered through the staff door, nodded at Janine without speaking, and filed the new returns with the librarian's exacting grace. At 12:05 p.m., she took her lunch break in the staff lounge, eating her egg salad sandwich in 5.5 minutes. She left the crusts, not because she disliked them, but because it made the meal last longer. Alone, she watched the steam curl from her tea. The silence was familiar, almost comforting. But that morning, something had shifted. A crack in the foundation. A patron had returned a copy of Wuthering Heights, its pages water-damaged and the cover slashed. Esther ran her fingers along the tear with a kind of reverence, and then fury. Not at the damage, but at herself. She had never been to the moors. Never kissed anyone in the rain. Never screamed or wept or clung to someone the way Catherine had. Her hands trembled. That evening, she took the long way home, passing a wine bar she'd always avoided. Inside, women her age laughed. One threw her head back, touching the man beside her on the wrist with casual intimacy. Esther didn't stop walking, but she felt it then, the chisel. The next morning, fiction felt heavier in her hands. The covers too bright, the titles too clever. She moved through the stacks mechanically, spine to spine, eyes unfocused. A footstep. A hush. The scent of something clean, sun-warmed, vaguely familiar, laundry and salt and youth. Her body stilled. She glanced up and saw him. Tall, a little slouched, a touch of wild in his hair. He walked without purpose, but not without presence. A kind of searching looseness in the way he moved, as though the world had only just started letting him down. And then, a pang. Not attraction, not yet. Recognition. Not of him, but of the ache within herself he had accidentally uncovered. It startled her, the way he seemed to occupy space without asking permission, as if the universe had always meant to send him here, just now. Esther smoothed her skirt. Her heart stumbled, then steadied. She stepped from behind the shelves like surfacing from water. She found herself in the fiction aisle beside him. That one's deceptively light, she said, gesturing to the book in his hand. Starts like fluff, ends like a gut punch. He looked over, surprised, but not put off. He grinned. His teeth were slightly crooked. That's kind of my thing, he said. Sneaky sad. They talked. Just for a minute. Then for 5. Then 10. His name was Kai. He was 23. Just finished his undergrad, unsure about grad school, taking a sort of gap season before making decisions. He'd recently moved to the city, had no friends here yet, and liked libraries because they felt like places that didn't expect too much. Esther laughed too loudly at that. The sound startled her. Over the following week, he returned. Once, then again, and again. Each time, they'd find themselves gravitating to the same section, the same corner table. They shared books. She brought him tea. He told her about his photography hobby. She confessed she used to write, once, long ago. Their words started as small talk and drifted into something else. The silences between them softened. And then it happened. She invited him up. No grand seduction. Just a rainy afternoon, 2 umbrellas leaning against her apartment door, and an offer of lentil soup and tea that ended in tangled limbs beneath the quilt on her couch. They kissed in the half-light like they were inventing the idea. He touched her like someone exploring a map of a world he had never imagined existing. And when he whispered, You feel like something I didn't know I missed. She pressed her face into his shoulder and told herself it was real. That night, neither of them left. They didn't the next day either. Or the day after that. Days blurred. The outside world slipped out of focus. Esther called in sick. Kai left texts from friends unanswered. Esther turned her phone off completely. They didn't mark days, didn't open the curtains. They ate at odd hours and slept in irregular stretches. The days folded over each other like pages in a forgotten book, and they drifted deeper, not into each other, but into a version of themselves that only made sense in that small, sealed world. Things shifted, almost imperceptibly. Esther began folding his shirts before he even asked, started anticipating what he might need. She stopped noticing the details of his past, their differences, the fact that he was just a visitor in her life. She knew he'd told her his age once, but it had floated past her, dismissed as trivia. What mattered was how he looked at her over tea, the warmth of his hands in the dark, the sense of something entirely hers blooming in the cracks of her life. She didn't ask about his life outside their walls. Not because she trusted him, but because the question felt irrelevant. Dangerous, even. Questions could shatter the spell. And Kai, he slipped deeper into the life she built for him. Her foods, her rhythms, her space. The more she wrapped around him, the more distant the rest of his life became. But neither of them noticed. Or if they did, they chose not to name it. Esther, at first, felt like she was blooming. She wore colors she hadn't worn in years. She left the curtains open. She danced, once, barefoot in the living room, and Kai laughed in that clear, unguarded way that made her feel 16. But beneath the newness, a subtle unease was growing. It flickered behind his eyes when he thought she wasn't watching. It hummed in the space between them when neither knew what to say. And yet, she clung to the version of herself that this moment seemed to offer, radiant, noticed, chosen. Then she had to leave. A conference in New York. Just 3 days. She almost didn't go. Kai clung to her, visibly anxious. But it was professional, paid, and somewhere inside, she knew she needed to remember what her world had once been. She kissed him goodbye with trembling lips. The drive out of town felt surreal, like she was watching herself from a distance. She wasn't leaving a boyfriend. She was leaving something else, something more volatile and fragile than a relationship. She was leaving her control. New York greeted her like an open flame. The streets buzzed, chaotic and alive. But after the first heady rush of solo hotel check-ins and wine bars, the silence of being alone set in. She thought she'd feel powerful. Instead, she felt hollow. She went to clubs, had a near-miss encounter in a hotel hallway that turned her stomach with fear, then fled into the night, rain stinging her face as if trying to wake her up. The next morning she walked into a therapist's office. Back home, Kai's first morning alone passed in a daze. He stayed in bed far too long, watching the light change on the ceiling. The apartment felt thick, like a room underwater. He didn't eat. He didn't change. He didn't think. The second day, he remembered the guitar. Then the camera bag in the hall closet. A name flashed in his memory, Lily, and with it came the sense that something had been left behind. Or escaped. By the third day, he ventured out. Sunlight hurt his eyes. The coffee he sipped tasted like a past life. His phone blinked awake under his pillow. Notifications scrolled for minutes. Friends. Family. Panic. And Lily. He sat in the middle of the kitchen, phone in his lap, trying to remember what kind of person he'd been before he vanished into someone else's dream. That afternoon, he walked the city alone. Found his old haunts. Talked to an old friend at a coffee shop. Laughed, real laughter, and then collapsed into tears again. He found a therapist. He told the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. When Esther returned, her key slipped easily into the lock. But inside, the apartment was wrong. Kai was gone. At first, she didn't panic. She checked the bathroom, the bedroom. But something gnawed. The bed was made. His backpack was gone. The hoodie he loved, the one she had once teased him about, still hung on the coat hook. Then the realization tumbled in. She didn't know where he lived. She couldn't remember his last name. She wasn't even sure what school he had gone to. Her mind tried to recall the number she had never saved, the address he had never given. It wasn't a breakup. It was a vanishing. And then something inside her snapped. She tore the teacups from the drying rack. Smashed two. Pulled down the books from the shelf they'd arranged together and let them fall, one by one. She screamed, raw, animal, at the ceiling. The pain of being left again transformed into fury. At him. At herself. At everything she had let slip through her fingers her entire life. They separated. Kai tried to return to Lily, to the life he'd abandoned like a dropped thread. Her parents were furious, his mother relieved, and Lily herself confused, ashamed, wounded, held onto him tightly, too tightly. They married quietly, almost in secret. He didn't protest. He didn't contribute. He simply nodded and showed up when asked. She wanted the wedding to mean healing. Instead, it marked the beginning of silence. Within months, she was pregnant. Kai didn't resist. He attended appointments, held her hand, said all the right things in all the wrong tones. He thought about Esther sometimes, but more often, he thought about nothing at all. Numbness stretched across months like fog across a harbor. Their child was born. He held the baby in the hospital, marveled at how small hands could be, and then felt nothing. No rush of connection. No terror. Just wait. The marriage collapsed quietly before the first anniversary. Lily was angry, but not surprised. She took custody. Kai didn't argue. He moved into a studio above a grocery store, stopped taking calls, and drifted. One night, with the windows open and the lights off, he sat in the bathtub fully clothed. He wasn't trying to die. Not exactly. He just wanted to stop. A breeze knocked a forgotten postcard off the counter. It skittered into the bathroom. A photo, black and white, of the sea. One of his. He reached for it. That was the moment something in him reached back. He started therapy again. He stopped drinking. He let himself cry, every day for weeks. He sold his camera. Enrolled in community college. Art history. Philosophy. He didn't know what he was doing, but it didn't feel like dying. That was enough. He worked construction for a while. Slept on a futon. Made friends slowly. Got a scholarship. Transferred to a university. Wrote a thesis about beauty and survival. By 30, Kai had a PhD in aesthetic theory and taught a course on radical art movements. He wore mismatched socks and kept sage in his desk drawer. He hadn't taken a photograph in 6 years. Esther kept going to therapy. It was awkward at first. She didn't know what to say. She folded her arms and talked about traffic, about work. But the therapist, quiet, persistent, knew where to press. There were long silences. Then tears. Then stories. Of a childhood spent being the good girl. Of all the times she chose safety over possibility. Of the years spent shrinking until even she couldn't see herself. She didn't have a single breakthrough. She had hundreds of tiny ones. Like picking gravel from a wound. She started writing again. Not because it was healing, but because she needed somewhere to put the weight. She wrote about quiet women and unsaid things. About the ache between what we feel and what we speak. She went back to the library. It hadn't changed, but she had. Eventually, they saw each other again. It wasn't dramatic. No tearful encounter, no awkward tension. Just a moment. A quiet afternoon. A small cafe on a corner neither of them particularly liked, but somehow found themselves in. Kai had a book open in front of him, one Esther recognized from the library's philosophy shelf, and she paused a beat too long. He looked up. Recognition came slow, then certain. They exchanged a look that carried more history than words could have. They spoke softly. The conversation meandered like a river with no destination. They talked about work, about the heat, about how the world felt louder now. Kai described his students with bemused fondness, their opinions reckless and raw. Esther spoke of her stories, tiny things, glimpses of interior lives, written only for herself. But underneath it, a current pulsed. She watched the way he cupped his mug, the way his fingers tapped the rim when he searched for the right word. She felt, not desire, not grief, but a curious steadiness. She had wondered, sometimes, if seeing him again would reawaken what had nearly undone her. It didn't. Instead, it brought clarity. The past didn't ache. It didn't demand. It simply sat there beside them, like a silent guest neither of them acknowledged. When they said goodbye that day, it was with a strange reverence. No promises. No lingering touches. Just two people bowing their heads slightly as if to acknowledge that something holy had passed between them and maybe still did. They parted that day not with plans, but with peace. A year later, they started meeting again. Not often. Sometimes with tea. Sometimes in parks. His parents met her once, offered polite smiles, wary eyes. She was now just Esther from the library. The second time around was not a passionate rekindling. It was something quieter, a gradual unearthing of selves they were still discovering. Esther had left the library, was teaching creative writing at a community college now. Kai had begun collecting obscure vinyl records and brewing kombucha in his kitchen. He'd taken his students to Burning Man once as a field study in ephemeral aesthetics, and the experience had marked him in ways he couldn't articulate. They moved in together without ceremony into a crooked A-frame house on the outskirts of a small coastal town. Not to resume what had been, but to begin something neither of them had names for. The walls of their living room became a canvas, Esther's handwritten poems mingling with Kai's black and white photographs, which he had finally begun taking again. There was no great epiphany, no moment when everything clicked into place. Just a slow settling into the understanding that life was not a puzzle to be solved, but a question to be lived within. That certainty was perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all. Over wine one evening, beneath a gibbous moon, Esther told him about her fear that she was still the same woman who had once clung to him like salvation. Kai laughed, not unkindly, and said, "We're all still everything we've ever been. That's the terrifying part." When spring came, they built a makeshift sweat lodge in the backyard. Sat naked under the stars, their skin sticky with eucalyptus oil, and talked about death like it was an old friend they'd been avoiding at parties. They began hosting gatherings, first small, then growing. People came to sit in their garden, to drink their strange teas, to listen to the words they had collected like sea glass. By the time they married, a quiet ceremony on a Tuesday at dawn in the Nevada desert, barefoot with a poet officiating, they had become something of local legends, not for any grand achievement, but for the way they lived within contradiction. The librarian who wrote erotic poetry about mortality. The professor who lectured on Kant while building altars from driftwood. People sought them out. Young couples struggling with conventional expectations. Middle-aged divorcees looking for permission to begin again. Even Lily came once, their son, now 12, in tow. The boy had Kai's eyes, his questioning tilt of the head. The afternoon was awkward, tender, necessary. Watching Kai teach his son how to build a fire without matches, Esther felt no jealousy, only the strange wonder at how life insisted on connection, however fragmented. They spent summers at Burning Man, not as revelers, but as elders of sorts, creating spaces for grief rituals and silent meditation amid the desert chaos. Winters found them hosting writing retreats in their home, where they taught not techniques but presence, the art of sitting with discomfort until it revealed itself as simply another face of beauty. Their marriage was not perfect. There were months of silence, brief separations, one affair that left scars only time could soften. But they kept returning to each other, not because they completed one another, but because they had learned to witness each other's incompleteness without needing to fix it. On their 10th anniversary, they sat on the cliffside near their home, passing a joint between them, laughing at the absurdity of time, at how they had built a life neither of them could have imagined. "Do you think we're happy?" Esther asked, the question genuine, curious. Kai considered this, watching a fog bank roll in from the Pacific. "I think we're awake," he finally said. "And that's more interesting than happiness." She nodded, understanding. They had not found answers or enlightenment. They had not transcended their wounds or achieved perfect peace. Instead, they had learned to live within the questions, to dance with uncertainty instead of fighting it, to find beauty not despite the discomfort, but within it. They became the kind of odd California couple that confused newcomers and inspired quiet pilgrimages. They taught workshops on embracing the unfinished narrative and the practice of beautiful failure. They fought in public sometimes, fierce intellectual battles that left dinner guests wide-eyed and unsure whether to leave or applaud. They refused to pretend that intimacy meant ease. At night, they sometimes still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they'd made the right choices. Wondering if there even were right choices. The difference now was that they could name these doubts without drowning in them. They were not everything to each other. They were not even always good for each other. But they were real to each other, and in a world of carefully curated presentations, that rare authenticity drew people to them like moths to flame. "We're all just making this up as we go," Kai would tell his students, his friends, the strangers who found their way to the A-frame house with its wild garden and wind chimes made from old silverware. "The trick is to make peace with the improvisation." And on quiet nights, when the weight of wanting still visited, because it never truly left, just transformed, they held each other not to keep from drowning, but to honor the courage it takes to swim in waters with no visible shore. They weren't symbols of perfection or models of enlightenment. They were simply two people who had stumbled through darkness long enough to recognize it wasn't an aberration, but a necessary counterpoint to light, neither more true than the other. And in a culture desperate for answers, their greatest offering was the permission to live without them. This was enough. This was everything,